Welcome to this trip through one of the scariest cases in Appalachian history. Let us know where you're watching this from. Everyone will connect with this story in their own way. In West Virginia's deep valleys, where the mountains seem to swallow the sky and the quiet holds ancient secrets, there's a name that families still can't say after almost 200 years. In 1846, Elk Valley was just a dot on the map. It was a remote area in Pocahontas County, where farmers had to work hard to grow crops, despite the harsh Appalachian winters and rocky soil. Communities lived miles apart in thick forests and only relied on each other during harvest time or when tragedy called for extra help. In that place, everyone knew everyone else. Last names were passed down from generation to generation, and blood ties were as strong as the roots of the old trees that covered the land. Something began to happen that year. People were going away, but not in a good way. We do it now with alerts and planned hunts, but it was quiet, like it would be for people who lived in the mountains. A cousin who left to check the traps but never came back. An uncle who went to the nearby town to get goods but didn't come back. A niece who went to see family across the valley and then didn't show up. At first, families thought that the disappearances were because of the dangerous area. There were black bears in the woods. There were still a lot of wolves in those areas. Winters could be dangerous for people who got lost at night. Every year, people died in the deep gorges and icy rivers. This time, though, something was different. People went missing in a pattern that no one could fully explain. But deep down, everyone knew something wasn't right. 3 generations of the Thorne family had lived in Elk Valley. People knew Josiah Thorne as a strict, busy man who didn't say much but owned a lot of land. The hill where his farm was located was just right so that he could see the fields and trails nearby. Went through the forest. He lived with his wife, 5 kids, and some seasonal workers who helped a lot when it was time to grow and harvest. Some people even feared the Thornes because of how strict Josiah was with his family and land. He thought that following rules was the best way to keep the norms and values that he had gotten from his family. He would often be the one to talk about land, animals, and disagreements between neighbors at community meetings. His voice had weight to it. People were expected to respect him. This was exactly why what was going to happen was so hard for everyone who knew the family to understand. The first people to go were distant cousins. There were many lines of the Thorne family that lived in Pocahontas County and other places. In that time and place, it was usual for second and third cousins to get married. This made the Thorne family tree very complicated, with almost everyone being related to them. Samuel Thorne, Josiah's second cousin, he left his small farm to talk about selling some furs at the Thorne farm. Along a well-known trail, the journey was about 5 miles. Samuel never got where he was going and was never seen again. His wife didn't ask for help from friends for 3 days. A search group was put together to follow the whole trail, look along the riverbanks, and check out places where wild animals often lived. Nothing. There are no tracks, clothes, or other signs of a fight or an accident. After 2 weeks, it was Martha's turn. Thorne, who is Josiah's mother's niece. She was 22 years old and on her way with a friend to a nearby farm to see family. The last place anyone saw them was on Josiah's land, where they stopped to rest and drink water. The next day, Martha's friend, who had nothing to do with the Thornes, kept going and got there safely. Martha chose to stay an extra day to help her aunt with some housework. She was by herself when she finally left. He didn't make it to the family farm. When the friend heard about weeks later, told police that Martha seemed nervous when they said goodbye, but they thought it was because she was tired from the trip. A second search party was put together. Once more, nothing was found. A lot of people had already been on the path Martha should have taken. The woods around were looked through. The mountain silence was the only thing that could help. Pocahontas County did not have many tools for investigations. The sheriff was in charge of a large area with many small towns spread out, across hills and mountains that are hard to get to. There was no telegraph, no fast communication, and no set way to handle situations of missing people. Families depended on their own support systems, like their neighbors and the people who could help them plan searches and keep the dream of finding their loved ones alive. But hope is a limited resource that is lost when there is nothing left to offer. Since there were no bodies, signs, or witnesses, there was only guesswork and growing fear. Talking in the local. The disappearances became the center of attention in churches. There were new ideas that quickly spread like flames. Some people talked about a group of thieves who had moved into the woods. Others said that Native American groups were still sometimes seen in the area, though fights were much less common than they used to be. Some people talked about curses, cursed lands, and angry ghosts that had been roaming the valleys for a very long time. In June, more people went missing. 3 people this time, all of whom were connected to Josiah Thorne in some way. That way. 17-year-old nephew working part-time at a sawmill 15 miles away. A cousin who recently lost her husband who is going to a family gathering with her 2 young children. An old uncle who chose to visit Josiah to talk about how to receive land that belonged to their grandfather. There was no way to avoid seeing the trend. All of the lost were linked to the Thornes by blood. In the time they were gone, they had all been on or through Josiah's land, and none of them left anything behind. A trace. Families started to ask more direct questions. Why only people related to Thorne? Why did a lot of people last see Josiah's farm? Why was there nothing found? Not even a shoe, a button, or a thread. Josiah Thorne helped with the searches. He climbed on his horse, got his kids and staff together, and followed the same trails that everyone else did. He always looked worried, and his voice was heavy with the news of the terrible disaster that happened in his extended family. It was his. His house was used for planning the search, and he fed the groups that spent days looking for the lost in the mountains. No one had a clue about him. How could they? Josiah was a respected farmer who worked from dawn until dusk to keep his land useful. He was also a family man. People didn't even think about the ridiculous idea that he might have something to do with the disappearances. Some people did notice something during those tense days of prayer and looking, though. It never seemed like Josiah was really shocked when someone went missing. He always reacted in a controlled, almost practiced way, and his eyes, when he thought no one was looking, held a weight that went beyond caring about his family. The Appalachian valleys were very hot in the summer of 1846. The constant sun seemed to kill the trees, and streams that were usually full of water started to dry up, showing rocks covered in moss that hadn't seen the sun in years. During this time, the number of disappearances increased in a way that put the whole area on silent watch. No longer did anyone travel alone. People locked their doors at night, which had never been necessary before. Women didn't go on the trails that went through the thickest woods, and kids stayed close to home. Fear had spread through Elk Valley like a fog that wouldn't go away. It was in every cabin, on every farm, and in every whispered talk around the campfires at night. Also, in July, 4 more people went missing. All of them had the last name Thorne, or were married to someone with that name. A family friend, a middle-aged couple going to see a son on a nearby farm, and 2 teenage brothers who went hunting for deer in the mountains near Josiah's home. The same method was used to look into each disappearance, but the findings were always disappointing. For days, groups of 10 to 20 men roamed the woods. Sniffer dogs from nearby counties were brought in. The tracks were looked at 1 inch at a time, but nothing was found. When people went into certain places around Elk, it was like they stopped existing. Valley. William Crawford, who was the sheriff of Pocahontas County, finally chose to make himself more visible in the area. He didn't have the tools to do a full investigation, but he started to ask more organized questions and write down details to try to find a pattern that wasn't clear. Crawford was an experienced man who had dealt with murders, thefts, and fights that turned tragic. But this wasn't like that. There were no bodies, crime scenes, or witnesses to any real events. There were only gaps. Families were broken up while they waited for answers that never came. He started to notice something about the people he talked to. A number of people said that the lost had been to or planned to go through the Thorn farm. Some had stopped for work, some for courtesy calls, and some just to get water or rest before going on. The farm was in the middle of the main trails that go through that part of the county, so visitors often stopped there. But the frequency started to rise, to be more than just a coincidence. Crawford made up his mind to visit Josiah Thorn in an official way. By the standards of the area, the farm was amazing. The main house was 2 stories tall and made of thick oak logs. It had a wide porch with a great view of the hills nearby. He kept the yard and barn in good shape and used the small sawmill to work with wood from his own land. It looked like everything was going well and was organized. Josiah greeted the sheriff with the kind of friendliness that farmers of the time. He gave them strong coffee, home-baked bread, and a place to talk in the shade. He was patient and seemed honest as he answered all of Crawford's questions. Yes, many of the people who went missing had been on his land. No, he hadn't seen anything strange about how they were acting. He was worried about what was going on just like everyone else. He would do everything he could to help with the probe. Crawford didn't know what to do after that talk, but he felt uneasy and couldn't put his finger on it. Describe. That something about Josiah's calmness, the way he kept eye contact the whole time, and the way his replies were always perfectly reasonable but never went beyond the basics. The sheriff started to look into the Thorn family in a sneaky way. He learned that Josiah was known for being strict, especially with his workers and children. He learned that there had been land issues in the past, some of which ended well for the Thorns, and some of which made neighbors angry. Loved ones. He learned that Elizabeth, Josiah's wife, was rarely seen outside of the house. When she did show up at community meetings, she was always quiet, always a few steps behind her husband, and always wearing a look that Crawford could only describe as deep resignation. When August came, it brought strong storms. Over the Appalachians at night, lightning tore through the sky and thunder boomed through the valleys like the roar of a very old, very angry animal. During one of these storms, there was an event that changed the whole course of that dark past. On the Thorn farm, a 23-year-old worker named Daniel Cooper showed up at Sheriff Crawford's house in the middle of the night, soaked in rain and shaking, but not from the cold. He was so shocked that his words were slurred, and he was crying. She calmed him down for almost an hour so she could understand what he was saying, and when he did, his blood started to boil. Even though it was stiflingly hot, it was cold, even during the storm. Joseph Thorn had Daniel Cooper work for him for 2 years. He had just moved here from another county to find work and didn't have any family in the area. Josiah hired him to help with the hard farm work. Another worker and Daniel slept in a small bed house close to the barn. It had been a few weeks since he had seen Josiah acting strangely, so he told the sheriff about it. The farmer would go out alone at night with his tools, and sometimes. After a few hours, he comes back with dirty clothes. Daniel thought he was shooting or checking his traps, which are normal things for a farmer to do. But Daniel woke up thirsty one night, about 3 days before he went to see the sheriff. He left the bunkhouse to get water from the well. It was late, most likely after midnight. When the moon was full, it cast an eerie light over the country. At that moment, he saw Josiah come out of the barn, carrying something heavy that was wrapped in a top. The farmer had a hard time, moving toward the wooded area at the back of the land while being pushed by its weight. Daniel stopped and looked away. Though he didn't know what was going on, something about the scene made him feel very scared. Then Josiah vanished into the trees. Daniel hid in the lodge's shadows and waited, freezing even though it was hot outside. After almost 2 hours, Josiah came back. Being without his load, he was now by himself with dirty hands and clothes. He walked into the main house without taking a look around. Daniel was too tired to sleep. All through the night. He tried to act normally the next day, but that scene kept coming back to his thoughts. What did Josiah have on him? Why do you have to leave in the middle of the night? Why the hurry and the secrecy? Daniel decided to look into it the next night. He slowly made his way toward the wooded area where he had seen Josiah leave after making sure that everyone else was asleep. To avoid being caught, he grabbed a small flashlight but didn't use it. The moon was still pretty full, so there was enough light, so he could see his way through the trees. For almost an hour, he looked at the ground, looking for signs that the ground had just been moved and anything that could explain what he had seen the night before. He found it after that. There was a spot about 300 yards from the farm where the ground looked like it had been moved. A space about 2 meters by 1 meter was covered with fresh earth. There were twigs and leaves all over it. There was a clear attempt to hide the spot. Daniel's heart was beating fast. He knew he turned around and told him to let the police handle it. But something stronger pushed him on. He dug with his hands and took off the top layer of leaves and dirt. He didn't need to go very far. He touched something about 2 feet below that made him jump back in fear. It was cloth, something solid that clearly has the shape of a human body wrapped in fabric. Daniel ran out of that forest like all the demons in hell were after him. He went back to the house and got his few. They packed up their things and left the thorn farm before dawn. For hours, he walked in the dark, falling over roots and getting scratched by bushes. He never stopped. He had to get in touch with someone and tell them what he had found. Had to get away from this evil place. When he finally got to Sheriff Crawford's house in a different part of the county, he was mentally and physically worn out. His story, no matter how impossible it seemed, was based on the darkest truth. Crawford got a group together. Guys you can trust before dawn. He didn't want the story to spread before he had solid proof. He and Daniel Cooper, along with 6 other men, set out for the Thorn Farm as the sun turned the sky orange and red. When they got to the house, Josiah and his family were still asleep. Crawford knocked on the door with the power that came with his job. After a short time, Josiah replied. He looked like he was just waking up, but his eyes were too alert for someone who had just woken up. Rest. He was told by the sheriff that he had to search the land. Joseph tried to ask Crawford why, but he was firm. He was allowed by law to do this check, and he would do it even if the farmer didn't help him. The others went with Daniel Cooper to the wooded area he had talked about in the middle of the night. It was misty in the morning, and the atmosphere was humid in a way that makes the air feel thicker and heavy. The men walked without making a sound. Only the crunch of their dry boots could be heard. They could hear leaves and sticks breaking under their feet. Josiah insisted on going with them, acting like he was barely able to contain his anger, as if this were an outrageous insult to his family and image. Crawford, on the other hand, watched the farmer throughout the whole thing, even when he thought no one was watching. There was tension there that went beyond the man's righteous anger at being looked into for no reason. When they got to the place Daniel had pointed out, the earth could still be seen. Even though leaves and sticks were used to try to blend in, Crawford told his men to start digging. Josiah kept quiet, crossed his arms over his chest, and watched with a look that the sheriff couldn't quite figure out. Did they defy you? Was it fear? Was it giving up? The shovels dug into the wet ground and pushed it away, making a pile that grew as the hole got bigger. As Daniel had said, it wasn't long before the stuff looked like it was less than a meter deep. It was this is the thick cloth that is used to cover hay or keep tools dry in the rain. The men stopped working and looked at Crawford, waiting for him to tell them what to do next. The sheriff went down into the pit and started to dig away at the remaining dirt that was covering the canvas. This made it totally visible. Everything changed when they opened that tarp and saw what was inside. The body of a man was there, broken down but still recognizable. He was dressed like a simple farmer, with worn-out boots and a leather belt with a buckle that many people there recognized right away. It was Samuel Thorne, Josiah's second cousin, who had been missing since April, 4 months before. A man was said to have never shown up at the Thorne farm and then disappeared without a trace. Dozens of people looked for him for weeks. He was buried not far from the house of his cousin. There was complete silence in the group. It looked like not even the birds were singing. Everyone looked at Josiah. The farmer was pale, but his face stayed calm, as if he were thinking things over. He had something in his mind. They were told to keep digging around the area by Crawford. There was more than one body there, even if there was only one. They found another homemade grave less than 5 meters from the first one. This time, there were 2 bodies, one older and one younger. Because they were so decomposed, it took a while to figure out who they were. But clothes and other personal items proved they were the 2 teenage boys who went missing in July while hunting in the mountains. More digging turned up more. Oh noes. In that bush, an area of about 100 square meters had been turned into a secret graveyard. That morning, 9 bodies were found. The farmer buried 9 people who had gone missing in the past few months and were all connected to Josiah Thorne in small graves on his land. It was like a wildfire getting the word out across the area. It was over for families who had been in pain for months because they didn't know what happened to their loved ones. Awful, hard-to-understand answers that went against everything they knew about people and how families should be connected by blood. Josiah Thorne was caught right away. He didn't fight back, try to get away, or give an answer. He did nothing but let himself be arrested and taken to the county jail. While the probe went on, his wife Elizabeth and their children stayed on the farm and were watched over by armed men sent by the sheriff. Everyone in the neighborhood was shocked. How did this happen? How could man do something so horrible to his own family? Crawford told the police to search the whole Thorne farm carefully. The house, the barn, and the sheds. The farm was looked over from top to bottom. They found tools in the barn that had what looked like blood on them. They found knives, ropes, and other things that could have been used to hurt or hold people down. Even stranger things were found in the house, in a locked room on the 2nd floor that Josiah used as an office. There was a book where a farmer kept very detailed records of his money, his goods, and his business dealings. There were, however, notes of a very different kind on the last few pages of that notebook. Names were given. Names of people in the Thorne family, times, and short notes written in handwriting that is so small it's almost impossible to read. The notes were hard to understand, but when you matched them to the dates of the disappearances, it became horribly clear what they meant. There was a date next to Samuel Thorne's name that matched the exact day he went missing. The word solved came next. The name of the niece who went missing in May was written next to Martha's name. This was done for all the bodies that were found hidden in the woods. What scared me the most, though, were the other names on that list. At least 15 names still didn't have their words answered next to them. They were the names of other Thorne cousins, uncles, and nephews who lived in different parts of the area but were all related to each other. And some of these names had dates next to them, as if Josiah were making plans for when they would all be next. When that book was found, It turned an already shocking case into something that was impossible to understand. It wasn't just murder going on. There was a strategy, a plan, and a list of goals that had already been set. Josiah Thorne was killing members of his own family one by one, and he seemed determined to keep doing this until the list was full. But why? What could have been the reason for something so horrible? Josiah was questioned by Crawford for days. The farmer wouldn't say anything. In his small cell in the county jail, he stared at the stone wall and didn't say a word when asked a question. Not even when the proof was shown to them. The body is his own notebook. Did he say anything? Elizabeth, who was married to Josiah, was questioned separately. Hard work had made her 42 years old early, and as things turned out, she had been living for years in fear of a secret she couldn't tell anyone. At first, she also refused to talk. She was shaking when the police said. She kept calling her husband's name and looking at the door as if she was waiting for him to come in at any moment. Crawford was calm, though. She could tell the truth without fear because he told her she was safe and that Josiah would never leave that prison again. 3 days of calm, reassuring talks were needed before Elizabeth finally spoke up, and what she said made things even worse at that mountain farm. Elizabeth told him that it all began many years ago, before the unknown disappearances in 1846. Josiah had always been very interested in land, property, and leaving a legacy. He thought that the Thorne farm should be the biggest and richest in the whole Appalachian area, but there was something wrong. The Thorne family was very big, and over the years the lands of the first patriarch, Josiah's grandfather, had been split up among many of his children and grandchildren. Josiah thought this was a bad way for the family's strength to be weakened. He thought that all of those nephews, cousins, and uncles stood for not just a split of land, but also of power, resources, and influence. He had also decided that getting rid of the branches of the Thorne family that he thought were weak or not needed was the only way to make them great again. Elizabeth said that Josiah's obsession had turned into a mission. He would talk about it late at night while lying next to her in their dark room. He would explain in a terrifyingly calm way how he planned to bring all of the family land back under his control. Each. The fact that his cousin had disappeared meant that the property would be sold or left empty, and he could buy it cheaply from widows or heirs who were too scared to stay in the area. When an uncle was killed, the line of succession was broken, and some of the inheritance went back to the other branches. Josiah had carefully figured out everything. He knew exactly who had to go away and in what order so that his lands would end up in the hands of the Thornes he thought were worthy and good in. In Josiah's skewed view, they were only his own children. Elizabeth said she knew about the killings. She had seen her husband burn bloody clothes in the house's furnace. On certain nights she could hear sounds coming from the barn, which she tried very hard to ignore. He left with his tools, and hours later she saw him come back and wash his hands in silence at the sink outside the house. She knew, but she did nothing. She was frozen with fear. Josiah had made it clear she would be next if she told anyone that she tried to get in the way, and she never had to say it out loud. Not just her, but also her kids. Elizabeth spent months in a silent hell watching her husband do horrible things while pretending everything was fine to everyone else. She helped search for Josiah, comforted the families who had lost loved ones, prayed in churches with the women whose husbands or children had been killed by him, and she kept the secret. The news of Elizabeth's testimony sent another shockwave through the world. Wave through the neighborhood. There was anger at her for not speaking out sooner, but people also understood how scary it must have been for her. The laws of the time were not kind to wives who spoke out against their husbands. This was especially true in rural areas where family ties and traditional social orders were still very strong. But Crawford didn't see Elizabeth as a partner. He saw her as a victim. Even though there was already a lot of physical evidence against Josiah, he used her words to build a strong case against him. Enough to get someone convicted. The trial was set to happen in September of that year. It would take place in a small courthouse in the county seat of Pocahontas that wasn't used for much more than property disputes and small crimes. People from all over the Appalachians and beyond were interested in Josiah Thorne's trial. People camped outside the county seat for days to watch the proceedings, turning the quiet village into a place full of morbid curiosity and a desire for justice. The courtroom wasn't able to fit even half of the people who were interested. The judge, a man named Theodore Hartwell, had to set up strict rules to keep things from getting out of hand. Families of the victims sat on the front benches. Their faces were scarred from months of pain and the recent news of their loved ones' horrible deaths. They brought Josiah in handcuffs, with 6 armed men following behind. As if he were still the respected farmer and not the old man, he walked straight with the same air of respect that he had always had. The scary person everyone now knew him to be. The prosecutor gave evidence that left very little room for doubt during the 3-day trial. A doctor from Charleston, West Virginia's capital, came to the Thorne property and looked at the 9 bodies that were found there. Even though there weren't many forensic tools available at the time, the doctor was able to figure out that all of the victims had been killed violently. Skulls were broken, and marks on the bones showed that heavy objects had been used, which showed that the deaths had not been quick or painful. The ledger with the names and dates on it was shown as proof of careful planning. Elizabeth Thorne's testimony, which she gave through tears and long pauses, painted a picture of a man who was crazy about power and money. Daniel Cooper talked about what he had seen that night and how scary it was to find the truth buried in those woods. During the trial, more witnesses spoke out, showing more of Josiah's bad character. People who had worked Over the years, people at Thorne Farm have talked about how badly they were treated and how Josiah ruled his property with an iron fist, punishing people physically when they didn't do what he said. Neighbors talked about long-running arguments over how to divide up land, and how Josiah had used threats to get people to agree to his terms. A pastor in the area said that Josiah hadn't been to church in years because he thought that religion was for weak people who needed comfort in the face of life's problems. He only believed in things he could control himself, things he could build or destroy with his will. It became painfully clear that his will was to get rid of anything that stood in the way of him building the land empire he had envisioned. It was almost impossible for Josiah to defend himself. Marcus Webb, the young, inexperienced lawyer hired by the court, tried to say that the evidence was weak and that the bodies being on the property didn't necessarily prove that Josiah had put them there, but his arguments were rejected. Rang hollow against the mountain of evidence that was shown. During the whole trial, Josiah himself kept quiet. He didn't say anything when the judge gave him the chance to explain what he did or show any remorse or regret. He just shaking his head. He looked around the courtroom and saw the faces of the broken families. There was no guilt or regret in their eyes. He seemed to be at peace with everything he had done, but there was an unsettling calm. It didn't take the jury more than 2 hours to decide. When they went back to court, everyone agreed on the verdict. 9 counts of planned murder were found guilty. Judge Hartwell said the sentence in a strong, clear voice. They were going to hang Josiah Thorne in a public square to show people who thought they were above the laws of God and people what would happen if they did that. 3 weeks later, the date was set. This gave people time to file legal appeals, but everyone knew that Josiah Thorne would still have to hang. When the sentence was read, some people in the courtroom started to cry. Others did not say anything as they thought about the fact that justice would be done, even if it meant the dead could not be brought back to their families. Josiah was taken back to his jail cell. Over the next 3 weeks, many people tried to visit him, hoping to get answers that the trial had not given them. They came to bring spiritual comfort and chances to be forgiven. He threw them out without any ceremony. Family members of the victims came and begged for answers, asking if their loved ones had. They had been hurt, if they had begged for mercy, and if there was a reason other than crazy greed for being so cruel. Josiah didn't say anything. Sheriff Crawford tried to talk to the person more than once, not so much for the purpose of the investigation, as for his own curiosity about how someone could cross the basic line between civilization and barbarism. Josiah looked at him with those calm eyes and said nothing. The execution was set to happen in the morning of October. It was a scaffold, built in the county seat's central square, a somber wooden building that stood out against the gray Appalachian sky. A lot of people came, some to get justice, some to learn more, and some just because it was the kind of event that would forever be etched in the history of that area. Other people came for a darker reason. They wanted to see the end of a man who had caused so much pain. Josiah finally asked to see someone the night before he was put to death. There was no minister there. It wasn't his wife, it wasn't his kids. It was his wish to see Sheriff Crawford. In the early hours of the morning, when the sheriff got to the cell, he saw Josiah sitting on the narrow cot with his hands on his knees. Crawford stayed put. The more he pushed Josiah, the less progress he made. The man should have been given time to talk. After being quiet for a long time, Josiah finally spoke up. His voice was low, almost like a whisper, but it had the same unsettling calm that had always been a part of him. He told him everything. Started with his grandfather, who was the first head of the Thorne family. The old man had come to Appalachia at the end of the last century, when the land was still undeveloped and had been fought over by settlers and native groups. He had fought, bled, and died to build the first farm. Through hard work and unwavering determination, he had built a small but strong empire. To Josiah, it was the worst mistake he could have made to give it all to his many children. Josiah heard stories about the Thorne family's greatness in the past, how they were once the most powerful family in the area, and how land divisions over time made what should have been strong and united weaker. He became obsessed with getting that glory back. He started buying land whenever he could, adding to his collection and bringing together things that were spread out. It wasn't enough, though. He thought he should be in charge of the land, but there were too many thorns and family branches there. And then he had an epiphany. People. In those mountains, they never showed up again. Things went wrong. Some travelers got lost. The forests were very big and dangerous. Some family members may have had bad luck, but who could say anything other than bad luck and the natural hazards in the area? Josiah said that he carefully planned each disappearance. He looked at the routes his family members usually took, figured out when they would be alone and vulnerable, and set up situations that would make them want to come to his property or to places where he could act. Not having witnesses. He made them feel welcome by offering food and drinks and talking about small family issues. Then he did it when he was sure no one would see them and the time was right. He told Crawford that he was quick. He wasn't a monster who liked making people suffer. He was just a man doing what had to be done to get things back to how they should be. The bodies were buried in the woods. The things that were on them were burned, and life went on. He took part in the searches. That he was truly calm because he knew where everyone was. He didn't find it mysterious. Other people did. Crawford listened to all of this with a mix of fear and interest. He asked Josiah about Elizabeth and how he could make his own wife live with such terrible events. Josiah told her that Elizabeth knew what she needed to do. She was a pain in the marriage, which meant she had to protect the family name. She might not like the ways things were done, but she knew what the goals were. She knew what the price of her weakness would be if she ever decided she could no longer carry the weight. Crawford asked Josiah about his kids and if he had thought about what it would be like for them to grow up in a house that was so full of blood. Then Josiah said that his children would get something very nice. They would own all the Thornlands together as a single family. They would be wealthy, powerful, and know that all of this was possible because their father was brave enough to do what other people wouldn't. The sheriff felt really sick when he left that cell. Not only what Josiah did, but also how he talked about it. His voice didn't sound crazy or like the ravings of someone who wasn't in touch with reality. Only cold, calculated logic and the unwavering belief that any means were worth it to reach the goal. Power and wealth were more important than family ties, human life, and any idea of what is right or wrong. After the fact, Crawford wrote in his personal records that it was the most upsetting thing that had ever happened to him in his career. Not because Josiah was a monster that couldn't be understood, but because he was easy to understand. Many men of that time felt the same way about land and legacy as he did. The only difference was that Josiah had taken those feelings to their scariest and least good ends. It was cold and gray in the morning of the execution. The Appalachian valleys were covered in a thick fog, and the air was so humid that it hurt your bones. People started gathering in the central square early in the morning, taking up all the space around the scaffold. In contrast to the usual noise that comes with big gatherings, there was a heavy silence over the crowd. The families of the victims were there, dressed in black, and their faces were marked with grief that could not be erased by death. Soon after 8 o'clock in the morning, Josiah Thorne was brought in with an escort. He always walked straight, with his shoulders back and his head held high. He wore simple, clean clothes. Some of his clothes were torn and his face was shaved, but he didn't look scared or sorry. Reverend Thomas Whitfield, the old pastor of the area, went with Josiah to the scaffold. He insisted on being there because he was waiting until the very end for some sign of regret, some word of regret that could bring comfort to the families who had been hurt. He climbed the wooden steps, which made noise as he did so. The executioner was a man who was brought in from another country just for. This job stood next to the rope. The sentence was read out loud by Sheriff Crawford, and his voice could be heard all over the empty square. 9 counts of planned murder. 9 lives were lost because of greed and unchecked ambition. In line with West Virginia law, the death sentence by hanging would be carried out. Crawford asked Josiah if he had any last words when he was done reading. The man who was being put to death looked at the crowd. He looked at the faces of people he knew, like the families he had broken up and the neighbors he used to respect. Him, the workers who were afraid of how strict he would be. After that, he spoke. His voice was steady and unwavering, carrying the same unsettling calm that had been a part of his whole life. It was his word that he had no regrets. He had done everything that had to be done to make the Thorne family great again. That the people who died had to be killed for a greater reason. That their lands and properties would be merged in the end as he had planned, and that their children would inherit the empire he had started to build. He said that death did. It didn't scare him because he knew he had done what he did on purpose. He then said, in a way that made even the toughest men in the crowd shiver, that he would have finished his list if he had more time. A scream of fear went through the crowd. A few women started to cry. The men clenched their fists and almost gave in to the urge to climb that scaffold and kill everyone. Reverend Whitfield tried one last time, pleading with Josiah to think about his eternal soul. Ask God to forgive you before you meet him. Josiah did nothing but shake his head. He didn't believe in God, punishment from God, or anything else that was bigger than what he could see and control in this world. The person putting Josiah to death put the black hood over his head and adjusted the rope around his neck. Everything went silent for a short time. The trapdoor opened, and even the birds stopped singing. The sad story should have ended with Josiah Thorne's death. But in Appalachia, where history and superstition are mixed together and the past never really goes away, the end was just the start of something else. People started to talk about it in the days after the execution. It was said that people saw the outline of a tall man walking through the woods near the old Thorne farm at dusk. The man always disappeared into the trees before anyone could get close. Workers who stayed on the property to take care of the animals and land, while the farm's fate was decided in court, said they saw strange things. At night, you can hear sounds coming from the barn. Heavy steps, the dragging of chains, and whispers that sounded like words in a language no one could understand. 2 weeks after Elizabeth Thorne was put to death, she and her children left the farm. She was unable to remain there any longer. She couldn't sleep because she knew that, lying beneath the trees in the forest, she could see where her husband had killed people from her bedroom window. There were offers to buy the house, but no one was interested. Several price cuts were made until it was well below market value, but no one was still interested. The land that Josiah had been working on for so long, and for which he had killed 9 people and planned to kill many more, stayed empty. The house began to fall apart. Windows were broken by thieves or just time passing. The roof started to sag. The fences started to rot, and the forest moved forward as if it had its own will, slowly taking back what had been taken from it. The 9 bodies that were found on the property were taken away and buried properly in nearby cemeteries. Each body was then returned to their own families. Families never got the same, though. Widows whose husbands had died had a hard time taking care of their properties by themselves. Children who lost a parent had a hole in their hearts that could never be filled. The terrible months of 1846 left scars on the whole town of Elk Valley. A lot of people started to leave. Some families could no longer live there because they could not look at the mountains without thinking of the terrible things that had happened in their shadows. Within 10 years, the area's people had dropped by almost a third. There were more and more abandoned homes, and the forest started to grow around all of them. Appalachia turned the story of Josiah Thorne into a scary tale. Over time, people would whisper the story around campfires and always end with a warning that men can become monsters out of greed and ambition. But the story was about more than just morality. It was the scary thought of how many more Josiah Thornes were in those mountains in faraway places. There were places where the police never showed up or arrived too late, and where people went missing because of the natural hazards in the area. How many other families kept secrets like this? How many secret cemeteries were still hidden in the Appalachians' old trees? Sheriff Crawford kept looking into things after Josiah was put to death. He was sure that all the bodies had been found, and that there were no more bodies hidden in the woods. He told a lot of people to search the whole Thorne property, and the areas around them. Teams of men dug up every area that looked like it had been disturbed for weeks. They found 3 more bodies, 2 women and a man, all of which were already badly decaying and buried in the same way as the others. They were able to tell that 2 of the victims were members of the Thorne family because of their clothes and other belongings. These people had gone missing years before 1846. This meant that Josiah had been killing for a lot longer than anyone thought. The 3rd person was never picked out. The official number of deaths rose to 12, but Crawford thought there were more. In Josiah's ledger, there were 15 names that had never been crossed off or given the word "solved" next to them. Some of these names were of people who were still alive and who Josiah hadn't reached before he was caught. Other names were of people who had gone missing years before in what seemed like random accidents or bad luck at the time. Crawford looked for links between these names and unsolved murders in the area. It was at least 5 times that the pattern fit. 4 people with ties to the Thorne family went missing without a trace. Before they disappeared, all of them had been to Josiah's farm or one nearby. But since there were no bodies or other physical evidence, these cases were still considered unsolved. In the end, the Thorne family's land was split up and sold at an auction. Buyers from other areas, who didn't know or care about the whole story, paid outrageously high prices for the properties. Low prices. In 1853, 7 years after Josiah was put to death, the main house was torn down. People who were hired to tear down the barn refused to work alone on the site. Tools went missing, and people always felt like they were being watched when they went near the spot where the barn used to be. It took 2 months to tear down the building instead of 2 weeks because some workers quit before the job was finished. When the last brick was dropped and the last board was taken off, the people in the area felt relieved, like a weight had been lifted off their shoulders. The forest, though, stayed. The 100 square meters where 12 bodies were found were never touched again. That spot was left to nature, and the trees grew tall and dark, casting a shadow all the time. Hunters stayed away from the area even on the sunniest days. A lot of animals seemed to avoid it, and the oldest people in the area said they could hear something other than the wind on windy nights when the trees groaned and shook. Sounds, maybe moans or the sound of digging far away. It was probably just a belief in ghosts. In Appalachia, though, the line between belief and fact has never been clear enough to really help. In the years after Josiah Thorne was put to death, new information came to light that made the story even more complicated and scary. In 1851, 5 years after the hanging, a fire destroyed some of the records for Pocahontas County. A clerk found old records of property transfers that shed new light on Josiah's true story among the documents that were still around. Reasons. It was found that he had slowly bought small pieces of land from distant relatives of the Thorne family over the course of 15 years. A lot of these deals happened soon after disappearances that were thought to be accidents at the time. Needy widows sold homes for a very small amount of what they were really worth. Heirs who were scared left land they thought was cursed, and Josiah was always ready to buy it and give cash to people who needed it the most. There was no denying the pattern in hindsight. A cousin would go missing for unknown reasons, and 6 months later, Josiah would pay a small amount of money to buy his property from the widow. As the year went on, an uncle would go missing while traveling, and Josiah's children would buy his land through a middleman. The strategy was brilliant because it was so cruel. Not only did Josiah get rid of people he saw as problems, but he also made money off of their deaths, which helped him build the land empire he wanted so badly. Had he not been found, Daniel Cooper would not have. If they had found that first body, Josiah's plan might have worked in the end. His immediate family would control most of the Thorne lands in the area in a few more years, maybe 10 times that long. Elizabeth Thorne never fully got over the bad things that happened during her marriage. Moving away from the dark areas of Elk Valley, she and her kids tried to start over in a different part of West Virginia. The shame followed them, though. The Thorne last name, which used to be respected, now had there was a stain that time and distance could not get rid of. The weight of Josiah's legacy was on his children as they grew up. Within their adult years, 2 of them changed their last names to get away from the family history completely. The oldest son, who was 16 years old when his father was put to death, left West Virginia and never came back. There were rumors that he had moved west to places where no one knew his name, where he could start over without having to worry about anyone else. From the past. Elizabeth worked as a seamstress until she died at age 68 in a small town in 1872. She had lived until that year. A local reporter who was writing about local history talked to her for a long time before she died. In this interview, which is kept in the West Virginia Historical Archives on a yellowed newspaper, Elizabeth finally talked about things she hadn't said during Josiah's trial. She told everyone that her husband's fixation on land and power had started a lot earlier than anyone thought. It was Josiah. They had talked about it since the beginning of their marriage, in 1827, when they were young and trying to set up their farm. Elizabeth says that Josiah grew up hearing his father complaining all the time about how his grandfather's land was split up. Josiah's father was angry and bitter, and he blamed the breaking up of the original estate for all of his problems and failures. At age 52, he died pretty young, bitter and poor, even though he came from one of the wealthiest families in. Josiah promised himself he would not become like his father. He would become the leader of a prosperous and united empire, just like his grandfather had been. He was ready to do anything to get what he wanted. Elizabeth said that in the beginning, she tried to talk him down and show him that the lands were not worth the obsession that was taking over his life. It didn't work on Josiah, though. As the years went by, he grew farther away, more focused on his plans, and more distant, willing to do things that a good man should never do. What Elizabeth said in the interview also showed something even scarier. Josiah may have killed his own younger brother, she thought. He had not been seen since 1838, 8 years before the murders that led to Josiah's hanging. At the time, people thought the young man had just decided to go west in search of work in new areas. But Elizabeth remembered very clearly that the two brothers had a fight just a few days before they went missing. His younger brother had gotten a lot of land from their father and wouldn't sell it to Josiah for the price that was being offered. He wished to start his own farm and leave a lasting impression. Josiah was very angry. That night, Elizabeth heard screams and threats. She also heard Josiah's brother say that he would never sell his land and would rather die than give in to his brother's greed. Then, 3 days later, he was just gone. His stuff stayed in the small cabin where he lived. His horses stayed in the stable, but he went out, leaving. Lizzie didn't dare ask Josiah about her missing brother-in-law at the time. She was having her third child and starting to see what kind of person the man she married really was. But she couldn't get rid of that suspicion for years. She thought that Josiah's brother might be among the bodies that were found in the woods at Thorn Farm. None of the bodies that were found were the right one, but there was that body that no one knew who it was, and that set of bones that could never be identified, be attributed to a specific person. She took this doubt with her to the grave, but the reporter who talked to her was so worried about the idea that he spent years looking for proof. He could never show anything. It was also impossible for him to find any sign of Josiah's younger brother after 1838. History buffs and people who study criminal behavior now study the story of the Thorn family. The case was one of a kind at the time, and not just because of how nasty the crimes, but also for the cold, calculated way it works. While he was angry or passionate, Josiah Thorn did not kill on the spot. He planned everything out very carefully and saw murder as a useful way to make money. It was hard for people at that time to understand this coldness and the ability to completely separate emotion from action. Researchers today would see traits in him that we now associate with people who are sociopathic. But there wasn't the right language in 1846 to describe what he was. People saw him as evil and thought that his greed had made him lose all of his humanity. The farm where everything happened was eventually split up into several smaller plots. On that land that had been stained with so much blood, new owners built new homes, farmed new fields, and made new memories. But the area of forest where the bodies were found stayed untouched by all the owners who came after. It seemed like everyone agreed in silence that the place should be there. If they were left alone, cutting down those trees or messing with that soil would be a sin. Over many years, the forest got thick and impossible to get through. Thorn bushes and other plants made natural barriers that even the bravest people didn't want to cross. The stories about that place grew and changed over time, adding supernatural elements that probably had more to do with people's fear of the unknown than with any truth. But there was more than just stories and superstitions. There is no doubt that there is something scary about that forest. Photographers who tried to take pictures of the area in the years that followed said their gear kept breaking down for no clear reason. When getting close to that area, compasses would spin in a crazy way. Animals kept outside would refuse to go past certain points. Most likely, these were just random events. There might have been a geological oddity in the area, like a mineral deposit that made magnetic instruments not work right. Perhaps the smell of animals that lived in that dense forest and were looking for food. Or, just maybe, places where bad things happen have scars that aren't just physical. These scars are echoes of trauma that last for a long time in ways we can't fully explain or understand. Josiah Thorn was caught and convicted with the help of Sheriff Crawford, so he was never able to completely separate himself from the case. He kept his job for another 15 years after being put to death, but his coworkers said he was never the same. There was a shadow over. It was like a weight on his shoulders. He kept a personal file on the case and added new information as it came in. He did this to try to find answers to questions that would probably never be fully answered. Just how many people did Josiah really kill? Were there other people besides Elizabeth who had to keep quiet out of fear? Which of Josiah's kids knew what their dad was up to? Crawford couldn't get rid of these questions until the day he died. When Crawford died in 1868, the Thorn case file he had kept was given to the county's Records of History. It's an interesting and scary document full of notes, theories, and unanswered questions written in the margins. In one of his last entries, which he made just a few months before he died, Crawford said something that perfectly describes how scary the case was. He wrote that Josiah Thorn's normalcy, not his bad behavior, bothered him the most. Josiah wasn't completely crazy. People in his community respected him because he was smart and well-spoken. He had family, friends, businesses that are legal. Still, there was something deeply broken behind that appearance of normalcy. There is no empathy or moral conscience at all. Crawford wrote that this scared him because it meant monsters weren't always easy to spot. They could put on familiar faces, act normal, and be a part of society while keeping terrible secrets. How many other people did the same thing as Josiah Thorn? Years turned into decades, and then decades turned into more than 100 years. The story of Josiah Thorn should have been forgotten over time, becoming just another incident in the long history of crime in the Appalachians. But some stories just won't go away. They are remembered by everyone and are passed down from one generation to the next, changing and being interpreted in new ways each time. People still use extra care when saying the name Thorn in Elk Valley and the nearby areas of Pocahontas County. Some families in the area can trace their roots back to those terrible years in 1846. Survivors' children and grandchildren who made it. For these families, the story is more than just history. It's a memory alive, a family tragedy that changed the paths of many people for generations. When historians started going through old West Virginia records in a planned way in the early 1900s, the Thorn case came up again as a subject of academic study. The researchers were interested in both the violent crimes and the social and economic conditions that made them possible. In the 1800s, America was a place where there were few laws and large areas where people lived in isolation and made their own rules, where disappearances might not be noticed or could be easily explained by natural disasters. Even though Josiah Thorn wasn't the only serial killer of that time, he was one of the most organized and whose crimes were written down in enough detail to allow further study. His case was used as a model for studying criminal behavior, the psychology of greed, and how being alone can make it easier to do horrible things. A group of college students from Charleston decided in 1923 to go on an adventure to the old Thorne estate. They wanted to make a record of the place, take pictures, and get soil samples from the forest where bodies had been found many years before. The trip wasn't well planned, and bad things happened at the end. 2 of the students got lost in the woods and weren't seen for 3 days. They were found dying of thirst and being very cold. It was said that they were completely lost. Even though they had compasses and maps, they kept going in circles as night fell and fear set in. One of them said he heard voices calling his name in the dark, pulling him deeper and deeper into the trees. The other person didn't talk about what he went through, but his coworker said he was never the same after that expedition. Soon after, he quit school and never went back to that part of West Virginia. During the 20th century, the property changed hands many times. There was no owner left for long. There was always a reason to leave the land, sell, or move. Problems with money, unexpected offers, and changes in plans were some of the reasons given in private conversations. Families said they felt uncomfortable for no reason, like they were always being watched, and had trouble sleeping on the property. Some kids wouldn't play near the forest because they thought something scary was going on there, but they couldn't explain what it was. The farm animals were acting up for no reason, especially at night, when there was a wind coming from that old, dense forest. In 1986, when Pocahontas County celebrated its 140th anniversary, a small memorial to the people who were killed by Josiah Thorne was put up, and it wasn't on the old estate. Instead, it was in the central square of the county seat, close to where the scaffold had been put up in 1846. The names of the 12 confirmed victims were written on a simple but powerful bronze plaque that said, "These lives were. Greed and ambition killed them, and that they should be remembered as a warning about what can happen when you let the desire for power completely corrupt your soul." At the ceremony to unveil the memorial, there were children and grandchildren of some of the victims, people whose lives had been affected by events that happened long before they were born. There was a woman there named Margaret Sullivan who was 89 years old. One of Josiah's great-grandchildren was her, one of the women whose body was found in those woods a long time ago. Margaret brought with her a diary that belonged to her great-grandmother. It was a treasure that had been carefully kept family for generations. There was one last entry in that diary that was written just days before the person went missing. The woman told him that she was going to the Thorne farm to talk about selling some cattle, writing that she didn't like Josiah, and that something about him made her feel bad. She said that business was. She had to get the money for her business. That was her last entry. Most likely, these were the last words she wrote before she left to meet her death. Margaret gave the diary to the county historical archives because she thought it was important to remember the victims as real people with lives, hopes, and fears, not just names on a list. The story of Josiah Thorne is still important because it shows something basic about people. We don't understand how someone could do something so horrible. We look for warnings, signs, and hints that should have shown them what kind of person he really was before it was too late. But the scary truth is that there aren't always clear signs. People in Josiah's community looked up to him. He kept his farm clean, went to meetings in his area, and paid his bills. The truth started to come out when you paid more attention to the details that didn't quite add up. The wife who rarely spoke and always seemed scared, the workers who didn't stay, among other things. Spent a long time on the farm, and his stories about the missing were sometimes hard to believe. But these clues were too vague and quiet to really make people suspicious until it was too late. The old Thorne estate is now owned by several different people. Over the years, the area has grown and changed. Older homes have been replaced by newer ones, and paved roads have been built through areas that used to be dirt trails, but the forest is still there. 12 people were buried in that 100-square-meter area almost 200 years ago, and it has never been touched since. As of now, it is part of an unofficial nature reserve that is protected more by tradition and respect than by law. There are small signs around the area that briefly explain its dark history and ask people to treat the area with the respect it deserves. There is also an unmarked cemetery. Not many people come. Most people in the area still stay away from it and tell younger people stories and warnings about it. People tell you not to go there. Don't go there. Though it's important to remember the dead, it's also important to forget about some places. It's not only possible, but maybe even a good idea. The sad story of Josiah Thorne shows how greed can go too far, how obsession can turn people bad, and how the desire for power can destroy not only people around us, but also our very humanity. It's a warning about the moral and geographical dangers of being alone, and how small communities can let horrible things happen without being stopped. It also shows how strong the people who lived were, how families rebuilt their lives after losing loved ones, and how there are communities that were strong enough to keep going even after learning that bad people can look like good people and live in places they thought were safe. We end this trip through the dark valleys of Elk Valley with a picture of that old forest that is still there after all these years. The trees are now very tall and strong, and their roots go deep into the ground, which hides some very bad things. They are still being blown through by the wind, which carries whispers that could be the sound of nature or the echo of something darker and older. On cold mornings, fog still falls over those valleys, covering everything in a gray veil that hides the past without erasing it completely. The earth has learned from its past, but never forgotten it. There are signs of that history somewhere in that forest, under those old trees that have seen it all. If this story moved you or made you think about how people are, how much we want things, or the costs we pay for our obsessions, please leave a comment with your thoughts. Sign up for our. Watch this channel for more trips through the darkest parts of history. Like this video if you think horror stories like this should be told, not to glorify them, but to remind us that being alert and kind are the only real ways to protect ourselves from the evil that can live in people's hearts. Until the next trip through the mysteries that time tries to erase, but never quite manages to do so.